Chapter 1. A New Perspective on Skepticism and Creation. In this chapter, presented in 3 parts, I begin with a critical examination of how dissatisfaction with traditional religious dogma, combined with an overconfidence in narrowly interpreted scientific explanations, has led many people, myself included, to dismiss the idea of creation far too readily. The modern intellectual climate often frames scientific inquiry and creation as mutually exclusive positions, creating a false divide. One must either embrace science and reject creation, or accept creation and abandon rational inquiry. I argue that this division is neither necessary nor justified. It reflects not a conflict between evidence and belief, but a failure to distinguish between scientific methodology and the philosophical conclusions often drawn from it. This is not an argument against science. On the contrary, science is an extraordinary and indispensable tool for understanding the mechanisms of the universe. It excels at uncovering the how of existence, revealing the laws that govern phenomena ranging from subatomic particles to the large-scale structure of the cosmos. Yet science, by its very design, is limited in its ability to address the why, questions of ultimate origin, purpose, and meaning. These questions are not rendered invalid by science, they simply lie beyond its methodological scope. Over the past century, powerful cultural and intellectual forces have reinforced the assumption that rational thought inevitably leads to the rejection of creation. Influential atheist writers, philosophers, public intellectuals, and media narratives have convincingly dismantled religious institutions and theological dogma. However, these critiques are frequently mistaken for decisive refutations of creation itself. In reality, the collapse of institutional religion does not logically entail the absence of an originating intelligence or purposeful foundation to the universe. I once accepted this conflation without sufficient scrutiny. Having been firmly grounded in atheism and disbelief in any form of creation, I assumed that intellectual honesty required such a position. Yet when I returned to the evidence with greater care and fewer preconceptions, I found that this conclusion was no longer sustainable. What emerged instead was the recognition that creation is not merely a theological assertion, but something that appears woven into the structure of reality itself, visible to those willing to look without ideological constraint. Through this lens, creation is not an antiquated belief, nor a retreat from reason, but a conclusion that arises naturally from sustained inquiry. By setting aside false divisions and cultural reflexes, we open the possibility of seeing reality more clearly. In doing so, we move toward a richer understanding, one that unites scientific insight with philosophical depth, reason with wonder, and knowledge with the enduring human search for meaning. Section A. Disillusioned by Doctrine, the Atheist's Journey. Atheism, and by extension the rejection of any belief in creation, often arises not from a careful study of science, but from disillusionment with organized religion. This was certainly true for me, and I suspect it is true for many readers. Disappointment with rigid dogma, glaring hypocrisy, or even personal, sometimes painful, experiences can all contribute to turning away from faith. For many of us, this step feels necessary, a way to reclaim independent thought, to begin thinking for ourselves as we mature. As noted in my introduction, evidence shows that atheists overwhelmingly reject religious teachings. Roughly 82% of atheists raised within a faith tradition consciously leave it behind. Because the idea of creation is so tightly bound to religious doctrine, rejecting faith often feels inseparable from rejecting creation itself. Yet this connection is not absolute. Is it possible to reject religion while remaining open to the idea of a creation, one grounded not in dogma, but in evidence? For many atheists, disbelief and the denial of a creator are so entwined that separating the two seems impossible. I contend that it is not. When we focus purely on the scientific evidence explored in chapters 2 through 6, Arguments against the possibility of creation begin to crumble. Reflecting on my own journey, I realize my early doubts about creation were born not from careful study, but from observing the contradictions and shortcomings in religion itself. In my younger years, I was influenced by atheist writers, compelling lecturers, and media narratives that reinforced disbelief. Science was often presented in ways that seemed to render creation unnecessary, even obsolete. Among these ideas, the theory of evolution stood out as particularly persuasive. I concluded that if life could arise and develop through natural processes, then the notion of a creator was redundant. Evolution became the bedrock of my conviction that creation was neither required nor relevant. For 40 years, I viewed atheism simply as the logical conclusion of a mechanical cosmos. In a universe governed by accident, there is no grand blueprint or higher intellect to factor into our equations. Human intelligence stands as the highest observer. This perspective offered a straightforward, scientific framework that was free from religious assumptions. My focus was entirely on what could be measured and proven. Over time, however, I have come to understand that evolution and purposeful creation are not mutually exclusive. Evolution describes an extraordinary process through which life develops and diversifies, and it is entirely plausible that a creator could have chosen evolution as the mechanism by which life emerges. Seen this way, the scientific and the framework of a design can coexist, each illuminating a different facet of the same remarkable reality. What first led you to question the existence of creation? Was it the influence of religious teachings or their absence? Personal experiences? The voice of secular thinkers? Reflection is critical. Understanding your journey is essential for engaging with the ideas in this book. You might wonder how examining your rejection of religion connects to considering creation. I argue that it is central. In the chapters ahead, I will show that the universe itself reveals evidence of design. But to see it clearly, you must separate the evidence from the religious frameworks you have rejected. Only by approaching the question with curiosity, rather than reaction, can you appreciate what the universe has to reveal. Adopting an open mind is rarely easy, particularly regarding deeply held beliefs. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that reinforces our views, makes challenging entrenched thinking difficult. Over time, many atheists reinforce disbelief in private or social dialogues, further solidifying their positions. Research suggests that the path to unbelief often follows a recognizable pattern. For those raised in religious settings, the journey is longer. It begins with doubt, continues with criticism of religious practices, and culminates in rejection of faith and community. My journey began like many others. I was born into a religious home, attended Sunday school, and went to church. My parents were not zealots. My mother was a devout but basic believer, while my father was a more contemplative man. He didn't subscribe to religious doctrines, except for some lifestyle and moral issues he knew were relevant, yet he lived with an intuitive sense that there was something beyond the sunset, a reality larger than the physical world we could see. Until the age of 12, I followed teachings without question. Then, a single moment changed everything. During a Sunday school lesson on life after death, I asked about the unreached, those in distant lands who had lived and died without ever hearing the Bible message. The teacher's explanation was fragile and logically unsatisfying. It implied a system that was inherently unfair. That moment didn't just spark doubt, it ignited a logical fracture in my foundation. I remember the walk home, feeling a sudden intellectual childhood moment when I realized I did not believe what they were teaching anymore. I realized the adults in the room didn't have the answers. I resolved to learn more. As I studied religion over the years, I became convinced that it was entirely human-made. This realization didn't come from a place of cynicism, but from a deep, scholarly appreciation for the texts themselves. I began to view the Bible, and indeed the sacred texts of many traditions, not as divine dictation, but as rich, wonderful, and profound literature. I saw them as the ultimate expression of the human heart, our ancient ancestors' best attempt to codify morality, community, and the search for meaning. In addition, I saw it as a means for those in power to keep control. I explored the origins of these beliefs with the same curiosity one might bring to the study of Shakespeare or Melville. I examined the perspectives of various organizations and traced the evolution of thought through history. And the more I learned, the more clearly I saw these ideas as brilliant products of the human imagination. They were mirrors of the cultures that produced them, filled with wisdom and poetry, yet undeniably earthbound. Within that framework, rejecting the concept of creation felt like a necessary sign of intellectual maturity. I had concluded that if the manuals for the creator were man-made, then the creator must be a man-made fiction as well. In my mind, the two were inseparable. To abandon the religious worldview was, by definition, to abandon the possibility of an intentional beginning. It would take decades for me to realize that while the literature of religion is a human map, the territory of the universe itself might still have an architect. Looking back, I am grateful for the discovery. My journey was never driven by cynicism, but by curiosity. It became clear to me that it was religion itself, not science, that had initially convinced me there was no creation. My fascination with religious study was profound. I was drawn to philosophy, history, the laws, rules, and rituals. By studying religion, I gained insight into the complexity of human belief systems and the ways they shaped societies. This broadened perspective allowed me to approach religion with curiosity rather than dismissal. I recognized that while religion could inspire compassion and community, it was also frequently used as a tool for control. These experiences deepened my skepticism, but also cultivated empathy for those harmed by manipulative leadership. By age 20, I had developed the ability to engage in meaningful debates with devoutly religious individuals. Many assumed I misunderstood their teachings, but in almost every case, I found their arguments surprisingly fragile, their answers more exercises in deflection than genuine engagement with fundamental questions. Throughout my life, I maintained an insatiable appetite for knowledge. I read extensively and critically examined every idea. Over decades, this pursuit solidified my identity as a confident atheist, convinced that the universe was a cosmic accident, a beautiful roll of the dice. Yet my early rejection of creation was shaped less by science than by observing religion's contradictions. Ironically, it was these flaws within religion that cemented my disbelief. I had been so busy pointing out the inconsistencies of faith that I had ignored the impossible precision of the science. Whatever your journey, I encourage you to approach the evidence in chapters 2 through 6 with an open mind. Suspend preconceptions and re-examine creation not through the lens of past dogma or reaction, but through observation, reason, and evidence. The universe has a story to tell, one that deserves to be seen clearly. Section B, Challenging Faith. What atheism's leading figures taught us. Atheists often find inspiration in thinkers whose ideas have profoundly shaped modern discourse on reason, skepticism, and unbelief. Figures such as Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Hawking, Sam Harris, Carl Sagan, Bertrand Russell, Ayn Rand, and Madeleine Murray O'Hair have not only influenced my understanding of religion and atheism, but also helped define the broader intellectual pursuit of truth. For much of my life, their works were more than just books. They were mentors. They taught me how to question, how to demand evidence, and how to remain steadfast in the face of societal pressure to just believe. The writings of these individuals resonate deeply with those who value rational thought and intellectual independence. Their courage in standing against dogmatic authority is something I still admire today. Yet, upon closer examination of their collective arguments, a recurring and somewhat startling theme becomes apparent. Ayn Rand, for example, famously declared, "I want to fight religion as the root of all human lying. I want to prove that religion breaks a character before it's formed, in childhood, by teaching a child lies before he knows what a lie is. Rand's statement exposes a pattern I had not fully appreciated during my decades of skepticism. While prominent atheist thinkers launch vigorous, necessary critiques of religion, they seldom pursue an equally rigorous examination of the possibility of creation itself. Her rejection of religion becomes, by extension, an automatic rejection of any intelligent cause behind existence. While her determination to confront dogma is evident, her arguments, like those of many others, focus primarily on the institutional and moral failings of religion, rather than on the deeper metaphysical questions concerning existence itself. After re-examining the arguments advanced by these prominent atheists, ironically, the very individuals whose ideas I once championed in debates, I was struck by how limited their case against the possibility of creation actually appeared. Despite their diverse backgrounds and disciplines, their conclusions often echoed one another in a specific way. Nearly every argument against creation ultimately turned out to be an argument against the inconsistencies and contradictions of organized religion, rather than against the concept of a purposeful beginning. Atheist writers often target the dogmatic aspects of religion, original sin, eternal punishment, or the authority of Scripture, arguing that religious morality is deeply flawed. They frequently cite examples of intolerance, violence, or injustice perpetrated in religion's name. These critiques are often valid. They expose the excesses of human institutions. However, they rarely engage directly with the central question of creation. Demonstrating the moral failings of religious leaders or the severity of doctrines such as hell does little to address whether an intelligent cause underlies the mathematical precision of the universe. Similarly, atheists often reject biblical literalism, emphasizing contradictions, inaccuracies, and pre-scientific worldviews within sacred texts. As I have stated, I view these texts as wonderful literature, but literature of human origin. Disputing the Genesis narrative is straightforward for any modern person, but such criticism alone does not constitute a rational engagement with the evidence for or against a designer. We must ask, if we set the human books aside, what does the book of nature actually say? A common argument in atheist discussions is that religion relies on a God of the gaps approach, using God to explain whatever science has not yet figured out. From this perspective, appealing to a creator is seen as giving up on real investigation. The argument is persuasive, but I eventually realized it often flips into what I now call a science of the gaps mindset. This is the assumption that science already has, or eventually must have, naturalistic answers to every deep question, including how the universe began, how life first emerged, and what consciousness truly is. This science of the gaps attitude does not disprove the possibility of creation, it simply postpones the issue. Saying, "We don't yet know how life began, but science will discover the answer someday," assumes that a natural explanation is guaranteed. In reality, that is a statement of faith, not in a deity, but in a specific philosophical outcome. Take abiogenesis, for example, the idea that life arose from non-living matter. Believing that future science will definitely solve this mystery may underestimate just how challenging these questions truly are. The appearance of life, the fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants, and the existence of consciousness are not merely residual gaps. They represent foundational enigmas. The extraordinary precision of the conditions necessary for life, the cosmological constant, the strength of gravitational forces, and the intricate molecular architecture of living cells points to a level of coherence that science has yet to fully explain. Yet many atheist thinkers sidestep these fundamental questions, focusing their critique instead on the low-hanging fruit of religious absurdity. Christopher Hitchens, perhaps the most eloquent of the new atheists, exemplified the intellectual vigor that made atheism such a compelling force. In God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, Hitchens articulated a powerful critique of organized religion, contending that it fosters hypocrisy and suppresses inquiry. His rejection of religion rested on core claims expressed with passion. He regarded religion as a human construct designed to soothe existential anxiety and impose social order. While these criticisms are rhetorically powerful, and I agree fundamentally with his assessment of religious institutions, they largely target religion's human manifestations rather than the metaphysical question of a creator's existence. Even Hitchens acknowledged the limits of human understanding regarding the origins of the universe, yet he often used this uncertainty not as an invitation to deeper inquiry, but as a pivot back to the critique of religious faith. This effectively conflates opposition to organized religion with the denial of creation, a conflation that weakens the philosophical rigor of his argument. Hitchens frequently invoked evolutionary theory as a foundation for his rejection of divine explanations. The evidence for evolution is indeed overwhelming, but to reject creation entirely because evolutionary theory challenges literal readings of Scripture is to commit a categorical error. The existence of evolutionary processes does not preclude the possibility of an underlying creative intelligence. Rather, it describes one of its mechanisms. This tendency to refute the map instead of the territory is common. Lawrence M. Krauss, director of the Origins Project, offers a naturalistic perspective that downplays the need for a creator, famously stating, "Forget Jesus. The stars died so you could be born." While this framing celebrates the grandeur of the natural world, it sidesteps the question of whether those processes might themselves originate from intentionality. In emphasizing the mechanisms of nature, Krauss avoids addressing the origin of those mechanisms. A particularly illustrative exchange of ideas occurred in 2009 during a debate between Christopher Hitchens and John Lennox, the Oxford mathematician and philosopher, titled "Is God Great?" Watching this debate was a pivotal moment for me because it laid bare the two different levels on which this argument can be fought. Hitchens, true to his form, concentrated almost entirely on the moral and historical shortcomings of Christianity. He spoke of the slavery of divine supervision and the wickedness of atonement. He posed his famous rhetorical challenge. If there are thousands of religions, all claiming exclusivity, how can any of them be true? It is a devastating point against human institutions, and one I found myself nodding along to for decades. Hitchens was effectively arguing that because the map-makers were often corrupt or confused, the territory must not exist. However, Lennox, as a mathematician, moved the goalposts back to the laboratory. He didn't just defend a church, he defended the rationality of the universe. Lennox argued that the very fact that the universe is intelligible, that we can use mathematics to describe the movement of stars and the behavior of atoms, is a profound mystery that atheism struggles to explain. He famously pointed out that if our minds are merely the product of unguided random processes, why should we trust our own capacity for reason? If the brain is just a computer that evolved solely for survival rather than for truth, then the scientists' confidence in their own logic becomes a form of faith itself. This was the point where I saw Hitchens begin to pivot. While Hitchens was brilliant at exposing the crimes of the religious, Lennox was exposing the limitations of the materialist. Lennox argued that the fine-tuning of the universe, the precise settings of gravity, electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces, was not a gap in our knowledge, but a feature of the design. He suggested that it takes more faith to believe that these dozens of physical constants just happened to fall into the exact 1 in a trillion range required for life, than to believe they were set by an intelligence. Lennox's approach was a revelation to me. He wasn't asking me to believe in a specific miracle or a particular dogma. He was asking me to look at the mathematical signature of the cosmos. He differentiated between primary causes, meaning an architect, and secondary causes, meaning the mechanisms like evolution or the Big Bang. By doing so, he showed that Hitchens' attack on the mechanisms did absolutely nothing to disprove the architect. This conflation, treating the flaws of religion as evidence against creation, is the blind spot of modern atheism. Hitchens' rhetoric was effective because it resonated with our shared sense of justice and our frustration with human hypocrisy. But as Lennox demonstrated, you can be a staunch critic of religious institutions while still being a logical proponent of an intelligent source. One does not logically negate the other. Ultimately, the debate revealed that Hitchens was fighting a war against religion, while Lennox was making a case for reality. By setting aside the sociological distractions of the new atheists, we can finally focus on the foundational questions that Lennox raised. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is that something so highly structured and mathematically accessible? Ultimately, the critiques of religion advanced by figures such as Hitchens, Dawkins, and Rand have enriched public debate. Their influence has prompted us all to seek more coherent foundations for belief and morality. Yet their arguments, however incisive, often fail to confront the central philosophical issue: the possibility of a purposeful origin to existence itself. The question of creation transcends the boundaries of both religion and science. It invites an inquiry not merely into what is observable, but into why anything exists at all. As we turn to that question, the task is neither to defend religious institutions nor to cling to inherited certainties, but to approach the mystery of being with intellectual rigor and openness. Section C. Reconsidering Creation. What led me to reconsider my views on creation? How did I evolve from decades of disbelief to my current views and belief in creation? This transformation began about 20 years ago. Surprisingly, the catalyst was not a profound philosophical treatise, a sudden bang on the head, or a mystical experience. Instead, it was something as unassuming as a nature documentary. In hindsight, that moment sparked a journey of exploration and introspection, driven by 4 key factors that profoundly challenged my views. Firstly, I came to recognize that religion, not the concept of or evidence for a creation, bore the brunt of criticisms, including my own, in nearly every rejection of the possibility that we were created. For 40 years, my rejection of a creator was, in reality, a rejection of the people who claimed to represent it. I had been committing a fundamental category error. In my mind, the architect and the tenants of the building were one and the same. If the tenants were hypocritical, cruel, or irrational, I concluded that the architect must be a fiction. I began to see an underlying distinction that even the most brilliant atheists like Hitchens seemed to overlook. The flaws of religion are not synonymous with an absence of evidence for a creation. Human institutions are prone to corruption, power-seeking, and logical inconsistencies, but those are human traits, not cosmic ones. Dismissing the possibility of a creator based on humanity's shortcomings struck me as a flawed approach. I realized that if I found a high-precision instrument in the desert, I wouldn't dismiss the idea that it was designed just because the person who showed it to me was untrustworthy. The machine exists independently of the preacher. This epiphany planted a seed of curiosity, urging me to explore the idea of a creation independently of any anti-religious biases. Secondly, an introduction to quantum mechanics marked a profound turning point in my life. What began as a casual curiosity was sparked by my introduction to the double-slit experiment, a deceptively simple test that produced results so bizarre they seemed almost magical. Intrigued, I dove into the fascinating world of quantum physics, a field that would radically challenge my understanding of reality. The double-slit experiment, at its core, examines how particles such as electrons or photons behave when passed through 2 narrow slits. When no attempt is made to determine which slit a particle travels through, the particles display wave-like behavior, producing an interference pattern on a detection screen. This pattern is a clear signature of waves, rather than an expected band of individual particles. When a measuring device is introduced to determine the particle's path, the behavior changes. The interference pattern disappears, and the particles instead arrive at the screen as localized impacts, consistent with particle-like behavior. This challenges every classical intuition I held. It's not that the particles know they are being watched. Rather, it is about whether the particle interacts in a way that leaves a physical record. This suggests that at the most fundamental level, reality is sensitive to interaction and information. The sheer elegance and interconnectedness of quantum phenomena defied the notion of randomness I once believed governed everything. Was it truly reasonable to ascribe such a deeply ordered yet profoundly enigmatic system to blind chance? The more I learned, the more it seemed that quantum mechanics hinted at something deeper, a layer of intentionality embedded in the very fabric of reality. Thirdly, my perspective was profoundly altered by David Attenborough's The Private Life of Plants. This captivating documentary series, using groundbreaking time-lapse photography and accelerated video footage, revealed a hidden world of plant behavior I had never imagined. For someone who had viewed plants as little more than passive, stationary objects, this was a revelation. It was as if a veil had been lifted. The plants in the time-lapse sequences took on mammal-like qualities in their relentless drive to survive, compete, and reproduce. Watching this series, I was captivated by what can only be described as a quiet, organic intelligence. Through the magic of the time-lapse, I saw plants engaged in slow-motion battles for territory. I watched as vines used their tendrils like sensitive fingers, reaching out into the air, circling and searching until they made contact with a support, at which point they would instantly coil with the precision of a lasso. It was a strategic, goal-oriented movement that felt entirely purposeful. Far from being static, these organisms were shown to be dynamic and resilient. I saw roots that didn't just grow downward, but stretched with uncanny accuracy toward hidden water sources, as if they could sense the moisture from a distance. I watched blossoms time their blooming to coincide precisely with the arrival of specific pollinators, often using complex chemical lures or physical traps. This was not the behavior of a biological accident. It was a refined, built-in wisdom, honed and encoded into the very biology of the species. The more I learned, the more it seemed that intelligence was not confined to brains. It was embedded in life itself. If even a seemingly simple organism like a plant demonstrates such intricate mechanisms and finely tuned adaptations, what does that imply about the larger systems of nature? Was the apparent purposefulness in these processes a mere illusion, or was it evidence of a deeper intentionality within nature? As a skeptic, I had always believed in a universe of blind chance, but the intelligence of the green world suggested that the code of life was written with a specific intent in mind. Finally, a personal family circumstance compelled me to confront the fragility and wonder of life and death. These moments of profound introspection have a way of stripping away intellectual pretenses. I found myself standing at a crossroads where the cold, indifferent answers of my atheism, that we are merely biological accidents in a random cosmos, could no longer satisfy the deep questions of meaning and purpose that were now knocking at my door. This emotional and intellectual shift propelled me into a much deeper study of the very science I had always taken for granted. For much of my life, I was a passive believer in the scientific consensus. I simply assumed that the mystery of life's origins had been solved decades ago. I believed, as many do, that science had it all figured out, that there was a tidy, well-proven explanation for how a chaotic, prehistoric soup transformed into a living, breathing cell. Yet, as I dug deeper into the actual data, I was astonished to find that science hasn't got a clue about how life could have evolved on its own. The transition from non-living matter to the first self-replicating molecules remains one of the greatest enigmas in human history. I had expected to find a clear path of evolutionary stepping stones, but instead I found a massive, unexplained leap. I began to look at DNA not just as a biological molecule, but as the fundamental software of existence. The precision of the information encoded in DNA, the building blocks of life, defies an accidental explanation. We are talking about thousands of pages of complex, functional instructions that must be exactly right for life to even begin. In any other context, whether it is a computer program or a piece of literature, we immediately recognize that such high-level, specified information requires an intelligent input. Yet, in biology, I had been trained to believe that blind chance was a sufficient explanation. I had reached a point where it required more faith to believe that this digital code wrote itself than to believe it was the work of a creator. This realization was the final weight that tipped the scales. My atheism could be traced back to the age of 12, when a simplistic and dismissive Sunday school lesson left me disillusioned. I realized how unfair it was to let the shortcomings of human institutions, or the vile concept of hell, a tool of torture used to frighten children, dictate my stance on such a profound question. Separating these human failures from the concept of a creation allowed me to approach existence with fresh eyes. While I view the Bible and other religious texts as profound literature, the ultimate expression of the human heart, they are products of human imagination. However, the universe itself appears to be a masterpiece of intricate design. This journey led me to the logical conclusion that there was, in fact, a creation, and, by extension, a creator. This marked my transition to becoming a scientific creationist. This title reflects my commitment to evidence-based inquiry, untethered from human religious doctrines. I am not looking for a God in a religious book. I am looking for the architect in the evidence.